So at the New Economy Forum, we're here to talk about the big questions about the future. What's the terminal destination for President Trump's tariffs? Is the AI revolution taking us into a tech utopia or a dystopia? We'll get to the future in a second, but before we do, I want to spend a moment in the past, and in particular, thinking about a French historian called Fernand Braudel. Now, Braudel was a polymath and a genius, and one of his gifts to the world was the idea that there are three cycles of historical time. First, there's events. Banner headlines on Bloomberg.com today, lost in the digital void tomorrow. Braudel called them fireflies on the stage of history. Next, there's something that Braudel called conjunctures, but I think we might call paradigm shifts, like the end of the Cold War, which echo not just for days or weeks, but for years and decades. And lastly, and this was the focus of Braudel's research, there's the longue durée, the bedrock of climate, geography, social structures that changes only over centuries or millennia, but which underpins and shapes the course of events and the nature of paradigm shifts. Well, you don't have to be here at the New Economy Forum in Singapore to know that the course of events has sped up. Now, some of that is headlines generated by a US president with a remarkable talent for keeping himself at the center of public affairs. As you can see in this chart, a remarkable share of headlines from news this year have mentioned President Trump in one way or another. But some of these events are important. Tariff hikes, shifts in the US security posture, challenges to central bank independence. What's the collective noun for a group of fireflies? Does anybody know? It's a glow of fireflies. Isn't that nice? But for our purposes, the collective noun for a group of fireflies is a paradigm shift. And let me talk about that paradigm shift in two dimensions. First, trade. From the end of World War II, 1947, and the signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995, the US was a champion of free trade. That's no longer the case. As you can see in this chart, in President Trump's second term, the US tariff rate has jumped all the way from 2% to 15%. That's the biggest tariff hike from the US in history, going all the way back to the 19th century, and it takes tariffs all the way back to levels last seen in World War II. A historic tariff hike, and we would expect historic consequences. To gauge how significant those consequences will be, we've turned to a computable general equilibrium model of the global economy. When we plug in that 15% tariff hike, the model tells us that the US is destined to play a much smaller role in global trade. As you can see in the chart, by 2030, global exports to the United States are set to be some 20% smaller than they would have been if no tariffs were imposed. And for many Asian nations, India, China, South Korea, the blow to sales to the US will be even larger. That's bad news for Asian nations, which have grown quickly by riding the wave of export opportunity. It's also bad news for the United States, which risks being cut off from what many are calling the Asian century. Let's talk about security. A key feature of Trump's second term has been a shift in the US security posture. Cutting funding for Ukraine, bluntly informing NATO allies to pay up for their defense or look out for themselves. This is a picture of the G7 leaders meeting in Canada from earlier this year. Can anyone see who's missing from this picture? the symbolism is palpable. What happens when the global policeman heads home? Well, to borrow the title of one of Hollywood's hits from 2025, it's one battle after another. There's peace in Gaza and a UN resolution that promises a basis for sustaining that peace, and that's good news. But war in Ukraine continues, and many fear that Putin will next set his sights on NATO's eastern frontier in the Baltics. India and Pakistan have had one of the fiercest exchanges in decades. Cambodia and Thailand have exchanged fire at their border. And that's bad news for the global economy. More defense spending means more debt. We think European nations will have to add more than 2 trillion to their borrowing over the next decade to meet that obligation to hit 3.5% of GDP in defense spending. And when conflict does erupt, that can mean a blow to supply chains, sending prices spiraling higher and bringing growth grinding to a halt. We saw that when Russia invaded Ukraine and cut off Europe's energy pipelines. Well, guess what? If there's conflict in the Taiwan Strait, impacting the supply of semiconductors, which is powering the global AI revolution, the consequences for the global economy would be even more severe. How about Braudel longue durée, the bedrock of geography, climate that underpins everything else? Could we see changes even there? Well, maybe we could. Developments in artificial intelligence over the last few years have been nothing short of remarkable. This chart from researchers at OpenAI shows for different professions what share of tasks could be taken over by AI over the next few years. Would anyone in the audience count themselves as a top executive? Well, congratulations, and I look forward to seeing about half of you at the 2026 New Economy Forum, and for the other half, I look forward to meeting your AI avatars. AI promises to transform the white-collar workplace in the same way that factory automation has already transformed the blue-collar workplace. If AI valuations, which many say are extremely stretched, trigger a crisis of confidence in the markets, it's conceivable we'll have a market crash. And with tariffs high, like the tariff hike from Smoot-Hawley in the 1930s, the echoes of that unfortunate earlier period of history when market crash and tariff hikes tipped the US into depression, those echoes will get even louder. But the implications of the AI revolution could go even further. At this year's New Economy Forum, we are without the wisdom and the guidance of that giant of international relations and a founding chair of the NEF, Henry Kissinger. In the final years of his life, a focus of Kissinger's research was on the potential for a disastrous interaction between AI and weapons of mass destruction. How about climate change, the tragedy of the horizon, as Mark Carney calls it? Well, even on an optimistic trajectory, if technology and policy shifts enable an accelerated move toward a zero-carbon economy, countries like Brazil, India, Australia, many countries from Africa face significant costs as temperatures unavoidably rise. And if we fail in that mission, and if global temperatures rise more than 3 degrees above their pre-industrial revolution average, well, the climate economists tell us the cost to global GDP, stretched over the decades ahead, could be more than 12%. That's more than double what the COVID crisis or the global financial crisis cost the global economy. So China's president, Xi Jinping, is fond of using a particular phrase. And the Chinese speakers in the audience will have to forgive my atrocious pronunciation. 世界正在经历百年未有之大变故. The world is seeing changes not seen in 100 years. Now, I think what Xi is primarily referring to is the shift in trade and the shift in the security environment. Already a lot. If machines start thinking for themselves and temperatures continue to rise, changes not seen in 100 years might not be the half of it. We've got a lot to talk about at this year's New Economy Forum. Thank you.